All right, so let's do a fun one about inflation. Oh, we should do this too. Because we'll need this. Okay. I recently ran, this is done by Michael Mahari via shiftgold.com. And of course, as usual, we'll be using Zero Hedge's clean interface. I recently ran across the video produced by CNBC back in July 2020. It is titled, Why Printing Trillions of Dollars May Not Cause Inflation. That aged poorly, didn't it? How long is the video? It's a 10-minute video. We're not going to worry about that. And people wonder why I keep saying you should be skeptical of mainstream narratives. Yeah. The video was produced at the height of the pandemic stimulus and money creation. The video notes that the Fed's balance sheet has eclipsed $7 trillion. That was still nearly $2 trillion less than the peak at just below $9 trillion. Even today, the balance sheet remains north of $8 trillion. The narrator begins by pointing out that some economists were worried about inflation, and she plays a clip of an economist quoting Milton Friedman, who said inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. But the narrator goes on to assert that we really don't need to worry about inflation. Supply shocks have driven up the price for some goods over the past few months, yet recent history suggests inflation is more likely to stay low for a long time. No, didn't work out well, did it? Ironically, the economist who quoted Friedman later boldly proclaims, quote, the idea that there's going to be an outbreak of inflation, 4%, 5%, that is just not on the horizon. They were right because it was actually 8, 10, and 12%. And I bet that economist still has a job, probably. Fast forward to today, low price inflation, not so much. Price inflation remains stubbornly high 3 years after CNBC produced this video. And remember, that's according to the fake numbers. The fake numbers being this, the yellow line, which you can kind of barely see here, is the yellow and red lines are the official numbers. The blue line here at the top is the real number. And then on this second chart, so this top chart here is the 90s based alternative, and the bottom chart is if we use the 80s base measures. So if we use the 80s base measures, we saw that inflation peaked at around 16, 17%, and is currently sitting right now in about the 13%-ish range. According to the official CPI, it's only at 4%, and the official only peaked at around 8%, but they flat out lied to you. Like that's all that is. Because of course, if you're buying any food, if you go pay bills, you know that their numbers are not true. All right, so definitions matter. The problem with the video is its misdefinition of inflation as, quote, an increase in the price of goods or services over time. This definition of inflation muddies the water, and that's on purpose. The proper economic definition of inflation is increase in the amount of money and credit, or put another way, an expansion in the money supply. Price inflation, as Friedman alluded to, is a consequence of monetary inflation. That's correct. If you create more dollars, you have more dollars that are going to chase the same goods and services, which means you can put more dollars to those same goods and services. If you increase this money supply without increasing the supply itself, you're going to create price inflation, which we knew, and they just flat out lied about. When you use more precise definitions, it immediately reveals the absurdity of this video. It is trying to make the case that inflation doesn't cause inflation. This was the generically accepted definition of inflation as late as the 1980s, but over the years, the government, along with its apologists in the corporate media and academia, altered the definition to suit government purposes. They methodically conflated monetary inflation and price inflation until there was no distinction between the two. The standard definition of inflation bandied about today is nothing more than government propaganda, which is kind of what I just pointed out. Economist Ludwig von Mises explains the problem with this change in definitions. Quote, people today use the term inflation to refer to the phenomenon that it's an inevitable consequence of inflation, that is the tendency of all prices and wage rates to rise. The result of this deplorable confusion is that there is no term left to signify the cause of the rise in prices and wages. There is no longer any word available to signify the phenomenon that has been up until now called inflation. As you cannot talk about something that has no name, you cannot fight it. Those who pretend to fight inflation are in fact only fighting what is the inevitable consequence of inflation, rising prices. Their ventures are doomed to failure because they do not attack the root of the evil. They try to keep prices low while firmly committed to a policy of increasing the quantity of money that must necessarily make them soar. As long as this terminological confusion is not entirely wiped out, there cannot be any question of stopping inflation. The video proves Mises' point. And indeed, You can see that when we look at the charts. The more money that you create to chase the goods, it doesn't matter. The only reason why it started coming down is because they stopped the money printing. This is when the end of the stimulus was, and there was nothing left to do. You could see price inflation coming in like a freight train. It is true that monetary inflation doesn't always manifest price inflation. This was the case after the 2008 financial crisis. Despite 3 rounds of quantitative easing and nearly $4 trillion increase in the Fed balance sheet, price inflation as measured by the CPI remained relatively tame. Not in reality, though, because for the CPI was just not counting food, but inflation has been going up. If you look at prices from the early 2000s, we're considerably higher than we were, especially at the 2008 level. But that doesn't mean that there was, quote, no inflation. There was a massive surge of inflation to the tune of nearly $4 trillion. Really a lot more than when you factor the credit expansion thanks to artificially low interest rates. However, due to other economic factors, it didn't primarily manifest as price inflation. Instead, we saw inflation of asset prices such as real estate, the stock market, and even art. Still inflation, though. It doesn't matter. We still saw things massively increase. And the fact is, we don't really know how the money printing after the 2008 financial crisis impacted consumer prices. Economic theory simply says monetary inflation will lead to prices across the board being higher than they otherwise would have been. Had it not been for the massive injection of money into the economy, we might have enjoyed lower prices instead of moderate price inflation. We won't ever know. Regardless, the fact that CPI didn't surge after the Great Recession monetary stimulus gave Keynesian economics, married to theories rooted in, quote, aggravated demand, a false sense of security. The video claimed economists say there's been a break in the link between money creation and inflation in recent years as the banking system has become more complex. That's false. Sorry, complexity in the banking system doesn't supersede economic laws. The video does make a legitimate point. Money created by the Fed doesn't go directly into the hands of consumers. It is added to the bank reserves. It is only circulates into the broader economy if banks choose to lend. If the newly printed money stays in the financial system, it won't show up in CPI. Instead, the inflation will manifest in asset prices as it did after the Great Recession. We even saw this in the latter part of the lockdown era as stock market rallied despite the economy still effectively shut down. That's because people took their money and invested it in stocks because they knew that they were going to go up. But a lot of the pandemic era stimulus went directly to consumers. There were generous unemployment benefits, direct stimulus checks, and all kinds of loan programs. It was pretty obvious that this monetary inflation would quickly bleed into consumer prices. And yet virtually everybody in the mainstream media missed it. Even after it started showing up in CPI, everybody swore up and down it was transitory. It's not that they were wrong. They were wildly wrong, like not even in the ballpark. And economists told them it would be wrong. Sadly, a lot of economists don't seem to really understand economics. This is what happened when everything revolves around mathematical formulas and observations devoid of sound theory. This video should give you pause when you hear the same talking heads at the same networks insisting the economy is strong, there won't be a recession, and the Fed has won the inflation fight. Yeah, and that's, remember, the Fed has won the inflation fight by making inflation stay permanently higher. Regardless of what numbers we're going to go with, if we use their official numbers right now, it's above 4%, which that's just going to be their new target. Instead of 2% infinite inflation, they're going to say, needs to be 3 or 4%. And what they don't talk about is that is an exponential increase, which is a hockey stick, which cannot happen. It is unsustainable in the extreme. The Fed policy is making us worse. Joe Biden's spending policies making it worse on top of that. There is a solution. The actual solution to this, and the Federal Reserve, which is not constitutionally authorized, it will have pain as a result of it. And we have to end some of these government programs. That's going to be hard. But the question is, do we want pain now or do we want a lot more pain later? Because that's what's coming. But that doesn't make much of a difference because remember, everything's great. This is the best economy in history and Joe Biden's the most popular president ever.